Well, good morning to you all. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I am Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazilian Institute of the Wilson Center. As you know, this institution honors the memory of a president of the United States that valued very much open debate of public policy. Talking about President Wilson in the context of a symposium in international trade is quite interesting because it was under the administration of President Wilson that the United States opened itself up for international trade. It was during his administration, 1913, 1921, that the United States created the trade, the FTC, the Trade Commission, the Federal Trade Commission that deals with competition policies in the United States. The subject is a very important one. It's a very timely one, and from the perspective of someone that works in Washington, viewed from here, is right now a very toxic one. I just reading the newspapers today, the New York Times, there is a piece by Paul Krugman highlighting the fact that although Mr. John Edwards, who ran an openly populist campaign, based on economic populism, although he's out, the themes that he brought to the campaign are very much present, and sort of he framed some of important themes for the campaign on the Democratic side. Also in the paper today, news about protests by tens of thousands of farmers in Mexico, marched against the liberalization of the agricultural trade, this time in Mexico. This is a clause of the NAFTA deal, and they are protesting the fact that they cannot compete against U.S. subsidies in agriculture. As you are following the presidential campaign here, of the leading candidates, there is one, Senator McCain from Arizona, that openly espouses free trade, to the point of criticizing agricultural subsidies during the campaign in Iowa. But the two Democratic candidates remaining, Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, have similar positions. When it came recently for the decision on the Peru Free Trade Agreement, both supported it verbally, but did not show up for a vote. This shows how difficult this issue is politically. Both Senator Clinton, Senator Obama, when it comes to the Doha Development Round, their position stated in April 2007 are identical, has not changed. Both reject concessions on domestic agricultural supports, and both support opening foreign markets to domestic product. Obviously, this issue of international trade in the United States will be very much an issue in the U.S. Congress, and it will be interesting to hear from the various speakers, and also it will be very interesting to hear from the Brazilian government representatives, their perspective on how to move this agenda. We hear right now that there are new talks, new hope. My skepticism as a veteran journalist tells me that I should not be very much hopeful on that this year. But, well, there are people that know much more than I do about this. And in this world, with this, I would like to invite the Brazilian ambassador to Washington, Antonio Patriota, to come to the podium and to open the fourth Symposium on International Trade. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Paulo Sotero. It is a pleasure to participate in this fourth symposium organized by ABCI. It's become a tradition to gather here on the Friday before Carnival, and I think it's a very good tradition that we should maintain for those who enjoy Carnival and those who don't. Besides thanking Paulo Sotero, our host, who's been doing a great job here as director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center, let me thank Aloysio Lima Campos, who I see here at the first row, works at the embassy, and without whose diligence, I don't think these events would have been organized, so well organized. And I'd like to thank the sponsors as well from Brazil, Felsberg and Associados, Veirano Advogados. From the United States, Crowell and Mooring LLP, Miller and Chevalier, Sidney Austin LLP, Sandler, Travis and Rosenberg, PA, Thompson Hine LLP. Also refer to the Brazilian Associations of Law Firms, CESA, IBRAC, and the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, and Arnold and Porter LLP. April 2008 will mark the 4th anniversary of the ABCI discussion group, which preceded the ABCI Institute. Its purpose is well aligned with the Brazilian government's policy of working to provide training and international expertise to a growing number of international trade professionals in Brazil. The ABCI Institute aims to foster the study of international trade, providing, among other things, in-depth discussions of important matters, symposiums and seminars for trade professionals in government, private practice, business, and academia on various aspects of international trade, developing an international trade bibliography, researching and circulating international trade news, events, articles, and expert commentary and analysis, as well as any other activity directly related to the study of international trade. This year's symposium consists of 3 panels covering 3 of the most current and important aspects of trade policy. The Doha Round, of course, and I think we are all very pleased to have with us the Undersecretary for Economic and Technological Affairs at the Ministry of External Relations, Ambassador Roberto Azevedo, who I believe will be arriving shortly. There may be a handful of people in the category of those who know, who are absolutely up to date on everything that is going on with the Doha Round, but I don't think there is anybody better informed than Roberto Azevedo on this topic. So it is truly a privilege to have him with us to discuss the latest developments. It will also be touching on law and the environment, and just as Brazil has been taking a very prominent role in the Doha Round through its leadership of the G20 group of developing countries, I think it is fair to say that Brazil is a key participant on any discussion on the environment. The recent conference that took place in Bali, which brought together the members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is an illustration of that, and discussions on the future of the Kyoto Protocol as well. And finally, we will also have a panel on investment with the participation of a dear colleague of ours, also from the Foreign Ministry, Minister Ronaldo Costa, who is an expert on the matter. I think it's appropriate for me to mention that relations between Brazil and the United States have been advancing very rapidly in practically all areas in the recent past. I think it's possible to say that the bilateral relationship between these 2 largest democracies and economies of the Americas is now experiencing a moment of great promise, and we expect it to flourish even further in the coming years. And we find that it's through a dynamic exchange of information, such as the one made possible here, that dialogue and mutual understanding will help to enhance even further our trade and economic cooperation. So without further ado, thank you all for your presence, and I hope you have very productive and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
morning. Do we have sound? Can you hear? Yeah. Good morning. Welcome. This is the first panel. My name is Aloysio Lima Campos. I'm the chairman of ABCI Institute, and I'll have the honor to be the moderator in this first panel. I'm not going to spend too much time introducing each of the speakers. At your hand, you will see the bios of each one. I will just say the names that in the order that the presentations are going to be made. And to my left here, Ambassador Roberto Azevedo, Undersecretary for Economic and Technological Affairs of the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. To the extreme left, not necessarily politically, José Raúl Perales, Senior Associate Latin American Program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. To my immediate right, Jeffrey Schott, an old friend and fellow from the Peterson Institute of International Economics. And to my extreme right, again, not necessarily politically, John Huneman, who is going to be today's commentator. So we'll have the speakers talking first, and then John will make his comments at the end. Since we didn't have a chance to meet before the panel, I'm going to ask before you, all the speakers, that we need to keep it between 10 and 12 minutes each so we can have time for questions from the audience. So, if I may, Jeff, could you start? Would that be okay? So we'll start with Jeffrey Schott, and I'll follow with José Raúl Perales, and then Ambassador Roberto Azevedo, and finally the comments by John Huneman. Please, Jeff.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Normally, now that I'm out of government, I get to critique what government officials say. But now we'll turn the tables, and you can criticize what I say. The Doha Round is in trouble. It has been in trouble for a long time. And if you listen to conventional wisdom in Washington, it's not going anywhere. And everyone knows that conventional wisdom is always right until it's proven wrong. And then you have a new conventional wisdom. And I'm here to tell you what the new conventional wisdom is going to be when the next administration in Washington takes office next January. Right now, the Doha Round has the means to finish. The seeds of a prospective deal have been embedded in the chairman's texts, and indeed back in July of 2007, the texts that were circulated should have provided for substantial progress in the negotiations in the latter part of 2007. It did not. And the window of opportunity for concluding the talks in 2008 is now closed, despite what government officials say. Because they said the same thing in July of 2007 about the need to make progress in the fall, and it didn't happen. We're now 4 to 5 months behind that schedule, and therefore one will have to figure out what can be done in 2008 and what needs to be done to ensure that the deal can close in 2009. If you have a further time horizon beyond 2009, I think you can forget about it. The world is going to pass Geneva by. Second point, developing countries have been incredibly blasé about the systemic risk of delay in the Doha Round negotiations. This is not to say that they are the main cause of the problems, and the inability to lead by the United States and the European Union certainly has been a factor. So has the focus on agriculture as the essence of this round. It is antithetical to any economic view that this should be a development round. Yes, agricultural reform is important for development, but it is only one part of the development story that needs to be done in Geneva, and countries have been incredibly uninformed in giving sole priority to agriculture and not to the important needs of services and the infrastructure investment in the service sector that is critical to economic development in developing countries. Because of the delay, we now have a lowering of expectations of what can be achieved, but lower expectations breeds a vicious cycle of minimalism. In essence, what we're seeing is lower expectations means less political support to reform sensitive barriers that have been maintained through 8 previous rounds of negotiations, and therefore less chance that the status quo is going to change. This unraveling of ambitions is expected, has been expected for some time, but it is reaching a point where we risk a conflict about whether to move forward with a modest package, better than the status quo, but still modest, and what needs to be done by the dozen or so major trading nations, both developed and developing, to bring an agreement to fruition. That's why I think the constructive role that Brazil has played in founding the G20 and trying to bridge the gap between developed and developing countries is so important, has been since Cancun, but needs to be even further reinforced because the major trading nations in the developing world have to extend a bridge to the poorer countries in the developing world if we're going to have a successful outcome as well. Fourth point, services and rules agenda still play second fiddle to agriculture and non-agricultural market access. This strategy, as I said, has meant a lowering of expectations across the entire Doha agenda, and it is likely to soon lead to a further unraveling as countries who have some interest in the rules agenda find that that is going to be blocked, and therefore the rules text is likely to be further diluted. What this means as a practical matter is that very little, if anything, is going to happen on anti-dumping. This makes U.S. trade officials very happy, but it also means that other countries are likely to try to pull back in areas in the rules negotiations and elsewhere where the United States has what is called offensive interests, including fish subsidies. Fifth point. Developing countries that are interested in using trade to help advance their development strategies have increasingly turned to preferential trading arrangements. They haven't gotten much mileage out of the Doha Round in the first 6 years, and the pressures of competing in a very aggressive global market with increasing competition from China has meant that they have to find other ways to induce competition, reform, and new trade and investment opportunities in their markets. And so you have seen a spate of agreements between developing countries and, importantly, between developed and developing countries. That is likely to continue whether the United States is part of the game or not. In the end, given the political impasse in the developed world to substantially change existing policies, and the political indifference in developing countries to the systemic risk of a delay or failure in the Doha Round, a risk that could make it difficult, or at least impugn the integrity of the WTO as a forum for multilateral negotiation. I think that the strategy that Pascal Lamy, the Director General of the WTO, has put forward is the right approach. It's very similar to an approach that Bob Strauss told me years and years ago in the Tokyo Round, when we were trying to conclude that major negotiation. And he described trade negotiations like a jewel thief. He says, you go in there, you grab what you can, and you get out of Dodge. And that's the strategy that Pascal Lamy effectively has adopted. I don't know if he goes all the way back to Bob Strauss, but essentially he's concerned that you have to have a deal in order to maintain the viability and credibility of the multilateral forum. And that deal needs to conclude, take what advances have been made in the negotiations, and then go forward. There's one proviso to the Lamy approach that I think is essential. If you're going to have a modest agenda, a modest result, you need to ensure that the WTO provides a means for immediately pursuing the real problems of trade and investment in the 21st century. And that means that their governments should be thinking already about a built-in agenda to add to the package, an agenda that addresses already the challenges that are already evident in the multilateral trading system, those linked to trade and the environment and the abundant subsidies that are distorting trade and investment in agriculture in the name of energy and combating global warming. Here I fully share the views of the Brazilian government that the subsidies provided by the United States and the European Union to biofuels, the way they have been crafted is bad agriculture policy, it's bad trade policy, it's bad environment policy, and it's bad energy policy. And that's one area that needs to be in the built-in agenda, because what countries are doing is they're subsidizing, and then, of course, because treasuries are don't have unlimited funds, they are threatening to impose border tax adjustments to firms that try to sell them dirty imports. That will be a big blow to an open multilateral trading system. So will the increased demands of security that are already leading to proposals and legislation for increased inspections of cargoes before they can be shipped to the United States. That's going to impair a lot of developing countries trying to ship to the United States by 2012. A broad area for a built-in agenda. Time is short, but I think unless one has a forward-looking part of the Doha package, it is unlikely that countries are going to return to Geneva to pursue the real problems of trade and investment in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. José Raúl.
Thank you, Luisio. And thank you to the ABCI Institute and the Wilson Center, my own institution, to invite me to this conference. I'm going to take I was asked to play a bit of a Jean Provocateur here, so I will try my best to look at the Doha process a bit more politically, and both in terms of the current moment that the United States is living and the international economy is living, but also from the perspective of the interests of Latin American countries, perhaps elaborating further on what Jeff Schott has just explained. As most of you know, optimistic forecasts for the conclusion of the Doha Round in 2008, whether we even consider that it could be completed this year, point to an exchange of draft deals in agriculture and industrial goods. If the texts are reasonably acceptable to the corresponding committees, and there's a big if, we've all been into this before, this would lead to a horizontal process of negotiations. If, again, another if, there is sufficient advance in this, as ministers have recently stated in the WEF meeting in Davos, There should be a ministerial meeting in April of this year to then work on what may remain the most contentious items on tariff lines and subsidies. Again, deadlines have been missed in the Doha process. We were supposed to have completed this in 2004, so there is every reason to be a bit skeptical, not to say cynical, about whether this is actually going to be met. But for some reason, some of the political conditions that would facilitate the conclusion of the Doha round seem to be missing. And in this sense, I am going to talk about the case of the United States and also the case of Latin America. First of all, it's what we've been hearing very recently about the possibility of a recession in the United States and a slowdown of the world economy. Many political figures and analysts have stated that the conclusion of a Doha round now is all the more important because it will boost consumer confidence in the international economy and it may stimulate growth through trade. And this claim is also further supported by an understanding that emerging markets, which still have a significant amount of trade liberalization to achieve, and whose share of trade, of global trade, has been growing very fast in recent years, can somehow pick up the slack for sluggish growth in advanced economies. And indeed, conclusion of the round could send a very important signal about the willingness to tackle global economic problems and basically the willingness to find a way out of the current conundrum in the international economy, a rescue, if you wish. However, I want to, while their integration into the global economy has certainly been remarkable, I would like to question or perhaps remain a bit skeptical about just how much emerging markets can actually pick up the slack for the lack of growth in advanced economies, and whether consumption in emerging markets can actually replace consumption in advanced economies as an engine for economic growth. Interestingly enough, this is the case even if we take into consideration that the highest barriers to trade in the world economy today remain in developing countries, and that many analysts from the World Bank and other institutions have recently pointed out that if developing countries were to reduce trade barriers among themselves, this would significantly boost their prospects of economic growth. So this is something that could also be taken into consideration and warrants further discussion. The conclusion of the Uruguay round, and I want to go back to the most recent example of the trade negotiations that we did conclude. The conclusion of the Uruguay round took place precisely after the United States came out of a very short-lived recession in 1991. And if we think about it, the Doha round also was launched after the United States came out of a very brief recession in 2001. I'm singling those two episodes to make a point about the relationship between multilateral trade negotiations and the business cycle of the United States. And again, this is all leading to the political question the United States is living right now and the willingness to actually ratify a Doha deal. While there have been relatively few rounds of negotiation of GATT or WTO negotiations to make definitive conclusions about the relationship between these multilateral negotiations and the behavior of the U.S. business cycle, considering the most recent history, we are facing a very different recession than the two preceding ones, to the extent that in this case, or what we seem to be living right now, consumers are a much bigger part of the equation than they were in the other two recessions. So the links between trade and consumption and the characteristics of this recession need to be taken into consideration as we ponder just how much an effect on the recession will the conclusion of the Doha Agreement will have, not to mention the incentives for U.S. politicians to see in the Doha round a solution, or at least a palliative, to the woes besetting the American economy. Trade has become one of the political culprits on this occasion in the United States, as opposed to other recessions or recessive periods in the business cycle of the United States. It is further compounded by the fact that it is an election year in the United States, and American politicians have failed to make a convincing case that trade has made the people in the United States better off and that globalization is not a risk. Just want to leave that there because it is indeed a political consideration that we need to take into account as we look at what the prospects for the United States being able to move decisively on a Doha deal. Turning to the case of Latin America, I also believe the case of the Uruguay round and the conclusion of the Uruguay round may prove instructive for understanding the relevance of a Doha deal for the region and the political incentives, not to say the preferences, precisely for concluding such a round. When Latin American countries entered the Uruguay Round, they did so in the context of the most significant economic and political turmoil the region has suffered since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I believe an emphasis must be placed on the connection and specifically on the simultaneity of economic and political phenomena in the context of the Uruguay Round for Latin America. I mean, in all of trade negotiations, certainly, considering that trade is a redistributive tool. It has been so in Latin American countries. But mostly in terms of understanding just where there is a political will to conclude the Doha Agreement in Latin America, as Professor Schott was just mentioning. Simultaneous to the Uruguay negotiations, structural reform programs in Latin America involved a dramatic reduction in trade barriers, which was usually one of the most immediate and successful components of the reform process. Latin American average tariffs dropped from 28.6% in 1986, around the time when the round was launched, to 12.1% in 1995 when the round was concluded. And some countries saw even more dramatic tariff reductions, especially Brazil, which went from an average 51% tariff in 1986 to 13.2% in 1995. So there was a tremendous amount of political momentum for the enactment of reforms at the domestic level, that was paralleled by a change in attitudes towards a global trading system and the prospects of growth through exports, and the incentive for further liberalization at the multilateral level. While multilateral negotiations went through very difficult periods of stagnation and deadlock in the Uruguay Round, and many examples may be brought about this, Latin American countries like Argentina, Mexico, and Chile remain very engaged in the negotiating process, whereas the case right now is very different. Conclusion of the Uruguay Round spawned a renewed interest in Latin American economic regionalization, and this time under the banner of open regionalism and engagement of the world economy. The pursuit of a more advantageous position in the international economy led to a revision of the commercial infrastructure of the region and the pursuit of more dynamic regional initiatives under the rubric of further liberalization, like Mercosur or the Andean Community, which were relaunched precisely towards the end of the Uruguay Round. The scenario in the Doha Round is very different for countries in the region. These countries have already taken the brunt of trade liberalization, both in terms of rationalizing and slashing tariffs, as well as in terms of securing preferential terms or preferential access to their most important trading partners, mostly the United States, in some cases Europe, and of course we've recently seen also the spur of agreements with Asian countries for countries like Chile and Mexico. Further trade reforms in the region of the institutional apparatus, the complementary areas such as trade facilitation and such, remain very politically unpopular throughout the region. The logic of liberalization and engagement of the world economy has changed to what I would like to call a kind of a feudal logic of bilateralism and securing preferential relationships with the most important markets. Innovative regional institutional frameworks for trade like the Mercosur at the end of the Uruguay Round have languished, and in this case, Mercosur becoming a developmentalist, nationalist instrument more than a commercial one. In South America, in fact, we've even seen the resurgence of a certain protectionist spirit in the regional institutional framework, the case of UNASUR, for example, and the way in which the language of economic relations has changed in the region as opposed to what happened in the Uruguay Round. So the sense of political opportunity and of the deleterious consequences of not concluding the Doha Round are missing from the political landscape of the region, when for many countries it simply has become more relevant to devote their efforts to secure preferential access bilaterally to their most important trading partners. So in this sense, I would say that the spirit of multilateral liberalization and engagement, while certainly there in the sense of abiding by a rules-based system and seeing in the WTO a dispute settlement mechanism for achieving national goals, however, seems to be somewhat fading, if this spirit was ever ingrained in the political repertoire of the governments of the region. Now, that is not to say that there are some interesting and important cases of engagement of this in the region, and in this case, what Brazil has been doing in terms of, through its own trade policy, challenging the structure and some of the rules governing international trade while working within its institutions, which I think it's a remarkable phenomenon of this round, and certainly something that ought to become more institutionalized as part of what Jeffrey Schott had mentioned, as a bridge to be built between developed and developing countries in the international trading system. Thank you.
Thank you, José Luis. Embaixador.
Thank you, Luizio. Thank you and thank the ABCI and the sponsors of the seminar for the invitation. It's a pleasure, really an honor to be here with you. When I first read the title, the title of the panel, Unlocking the Doha Round, Perspectives for 2008, I thought, well, that's a challenge. Unlocking the Doha Round, if anybody has the key, well, let me have it. We're looking for it desperately. But I think as I was thinking about what I was going to say, and you said 12 minutes, I said, well, you know what, let me take 11 minutes diagnosing the problem, and maybe a minute saying what we should do. That's probably the smart way to go. So let me tell you, I think my approach would be to demystify a little bit about all these concerns about where we are. I mean, the Doha Round, frankly, has been in crisis for the last 18 months. Okay, it's been in the intensive care, near the cemetery, whatever. I mean, you read at the press and the statements. Everybody believes we're talking about a terminal patient. That's essentially what we've been hearing. But frankly, I mean, anybody who has been involved in negotiations for some time, the Doha Round is actually a typical textbook case of negotiations that have been prolonged for a long time. This is where we should be, and this is how it is. That's how negotiations are, particularly in a negotiation when you have a consensus-driven exercise, or you're talking about 150 countries agreeing to every step of the way, and where we're not talking actually about a zero-sum game, but it's pretty close to it. Wherever somebody gains, somebody else is losing, or perceives as losing in that particular area. So if you want to talk about games in the WTO negotiations, you have to look at a broader picture. And negotiators are usually not looking at the broader picture. The agricultural negotiator is looking at agriculture. And in agriculture, for him, it's a zero-sum game, or pretty close to it. In NAMA, it's the same thing. In services, the services negotiator, it has almost a zero-sum game for him. Now, there has to be someone above all this looking at the broader picture and say, okay, you believe this is a zero-sum game, you believe this is but actually, if you look at the whole picture, it is not. And there are gains to be had for everyone. Now, you need this higher instance looking at the global picture. And that's what I believe is what people seem to term as political will. Now, political will, therefore, comes from someone who's looking from above and looking at the whole picture and say, we need this. And this is something that is good for my country, for my society as a whole. Now, when I say that we have a typical negotiating exercise, a typical, at this typical stage of negotiations, which is pretty close to the end of the line, what is the dynamics that we have? Well, when you enter a multilateral negotiation, you enter with expectations. You have to sell that exercise to your constituency because they're going to be engaged. There's going to be a lot of time and effort put into this exercise. So what do governments, what do negotiators do at the beginning of the process? They say, look, you guys are going to get a lot. That's the way that you use to engage your constituencies. You go to your industry and you say, well, barriers are going to go down a lot and you're going to have a lot of new market opportunities here and there. In agriculture, you will say subsidies will go down or will be eliminated. So you sell a picture to your domestic constituency, not because you are acting in bad faith, but because first you do believe that you can get these things, if not the whole package, at least part of the package. But the fact of the matter is that at the beginning of the negotiations, the picture is pretty rosy for everyone. Now, as time drags on, as you move on the negotiations, Every time you go to the negotiating forum, you come back with less than what you started with, at least what you sold at the beginning of the process. So it is natural that at the end of the stage, after how many years now? 6 years? After 6 years of negotiations, you know for sure, and people back home know for sure, that they are not going to get what you promised in the beginning, or what they expected they would get from the beginning. And this is where we are now. It's tough. It's tough because nobody's getting now the perfect package. Nobody's getting now what they thought they would get at the beginning of the process. Does that mean that the round is dead? I don't think so. I really don't. But we all have to take on our responsibilities. The fact is also that the private sector now, in pretty much in every country that is sitting at the table, is not that much engaged. Okay, for several reasons. One of them is that they already know approximately what they would possibly get from these negotiations. So, number one, they pocket that. Okay, that's a given. So I don't have to fight for that. This is if this round comes through, this is what I'm getting. So they pocket that, and then they don't engage anymore. Okay, they know that they are not getting a whole lot more by that engagement. So they move on. They take care of more pressing issues. In Brazil, sanitary, phytosanitary measures against us are much more urgent to deal with now than the round. They know what they're going to get from the round approximately. They don't know exactly, but they know approximately. So the private sector begins to move on. They have other things that they have to take care of. So there is this type of disengagement. Another not irrelevant issue is the condition of the markets today. I mean, economies have been growing in general, so industries are actually doing good. They're not doing that bad. In agriculture, prices are high, and the forecast for the next few years is also of high prices, which means subsidies are going down, so nobody's actually looking too much at how much is the U.S. is spending on their commodities, because the prices are they're not forcing huge amounts of expenditures. The commodity prices are also up, so sales are good. Sales are good. The developing countries, the emerging developing countries, are taking up the slack from developed countries. So China, India, a lot of these net food importing developing countries have become major players in the agricultural markets, and they are absorbing a lot of the production. So the scenario is good. So why would the private sector actually be knocking at the government's door all the time saying, look, we need this round, we need this deal? So it's not, frankly, going to happen. Now, having said that, what does it mean, actually? It means that governments have to have the leading role. Okay, the governments cannot count necessarily with the private sector pushing them to get this round all the time. And it would be very difficult to not realize what the nature of this disengagement by the private sector means. Because the tendency is to say, okay, so they're not engaged, which means I need to bring home more. I need to do better so that they will engage. Well, that's a very dangerous exercise, if we go down that route. Because the most likely result is that this attempt to get more and better deals back home will actually mean that you will make someone walk out of the table. That's the risk that we run. So governments have to be ambitious, because a non-ambitious round will not fly, I don't think, for anyone. Everybody has to bring something back home. But they also have to be realistic. They have to know what this disengagement means. They have to have the right diagnosis and be careful about the politics. Now, having said that, the process has been pretty much well established. We're going to have text next week, and then we'll have another iteration, technical iteration. Then you have a revised version of the text, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 weeks from then. After that, hopefully, if the texts don't miss the equation too much, if they're within the ballpark and people don't feel that they have to walk away, then you would have the horizontal process with the senior officials, and later on with the ministers. Now, are there uncertainties in the process? Yes, there are major uncertainties, and the U.S. actually is a major uncertainty as well. although we hear all the right things, I believe, and I've been here for the last 2 days, and I've been hearing the right things from the administration. I was in Davos, and Ambassador Schwab was very positive, very affirmative that this administration wants the round. But there are mixed signals coming from the United States, several. For example, the TPA. Everybody you talk to, the TPA seems to be a dead end. You look at the difficulty of the approval for the bilateral treaties. That's not a very promising signal for a negotiator in Geneva. What about the Farm Bill? If you look at the Farm Bill, the project that's out there, an agricultural negotiator in Geneva would probably be very skeptical about what the U.S. can do in terms of agriculture if it only looks at the Farm Bill and does not listen to what we have been hearing, which is that the U.S. said once we get a deal, we'll fix it. We'll fix the Farm Bill, we'll have a new process, so we'll make it consistent with the WTO rules. So there are uncertainties. Now, have I gone over my 11 minutes? Because that's the last, okay. So what is the way out, frankly? The way out, I think, is for governments to take the leading role. They can't expect to appease everybody and to satisfy every single concern of their constituencies. We need this higher instance, someone who's looking from above and seeing that this is not a zero-sum game, although the delegates in their sectors believe it is. Okay, so there's someone up there looking and saying, no, we have something which is meaningful, which we need, and we have to maintain a good faith engagement, despite the difficulties, despite the lack of belief that this is a doable round. I think a negotiator has the obligation to try to find ways of convergence one day at a time, without guarantees. There are no guarantees that you're going to conclude the round. There are no guarantees that, the only guarantee actually that a negotiator will have, anybody who knows what a negotiating exercise is, the only guarantee that he has is that he will not go home with a perfect package. Okay? He will not. But he has to go home with an acceptable package, something that is good enough for his constituency, for his country, for his societies, and essentially for the world economy as a whole. And I think it is, at least I am convinced that at least the Brazilian government feels that way, that we have to continue, we have to fight on, we have to muddle through, no matter how long it takes. And what I can tell you is that as a negotiator, I'm committed to do that, and hopefully this patient would come out of intensive care sometime. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Well, thank you, Carlos. John, what do you make of all of this? Try to put everything together and see if you can come with an optimistic solution, maybe?
Well, from my time at USTR, and from just being now an outside observer for many years, I always try to be pragmatic. And I think at this particular juncture, I think Jeff led off kind of pointing out, as one should, from the perspective of a consummate, polished economist, and interpreting the politics in such a way that there are a lot of obstacles in the way of finding a solution this year. And in terms of his comment regarding the notion of relevance of the WTO or the negotiations once you get much beyond 2009, here again, as the global economy is evolving as rapidly as it is, and as the issues for policymakers at the highest level shift in light of those changing realities, it's a fair comment to point out that you cannot drag this process on forever and expect it to remain relevant. The interesting comments from Jose regarding the changing nature of the situation in Latin America and in the region vis-a-vis the Uruguay round when I was involved very heavily and now I think is a salient point as well, in the sense that clearly in a lot of different places the political environment has changed, not only in the United States but in Latin America, and that in some respects creates a different vulnerability to the success of this round in the immediate term, because the posture in some respects of governments has changed and their priorities have changed in terms of their broad approach to the multilateral system, the regional system, to the extent the regional system exists, as well as their relationship with the developed world and certainly the United States. Contrary to that, what I would say is my experience in dealing with Brazil over the years is that Brazil is ultimately pragmatic. And I think Brazil, in this context, as you just heard, is looking at this from a very pragmatic posture. And I actually believe that in the context of the posture of the current administration here in Washington, I have no doubt in my mind that the leadership of this administration is interested in finding a way forward on this round. I don't underestimate any of that. I also look at the agricultural situation and Jeff's point about how it is antithetical to development to think about this exclusively as an agriculture issue. From a broad economic perspective, he's absolutely right. And I think that actually what is motivating a lot of the process, the nitty-gritty, is not so much necessarily kind of a single-minded focus on development. This is a trade negotiation. For any of you who've been involved in either the multilateral or bilateral or regional context, your positions tended to be driven, or tend to be driven very much so initially, as Roberto pointed out, by the posture that you not only sell, but you hear from your constituents who take a real interest in the issue. To some degree, that slops over into a development benefit. To a significant degree, it does not, because it is really a reflection of the respective political realities that all of the countries bring to the table, and what's viable, what's important, and what can be sold politically. So I think we have gone through a process for many years now in Doha where people are calibrating that whole relationship. And as a result of that, we're now in a circumstance where this year, in spite all of the obstacles, I think there is a window, depending on kind of how things unfold in terms of the degree to which we can narrow the scope of decisions in the near term for ministerial decision, and recognize that the likelihood of wrapping this entire thing up in a neat bow and package this year is extremely difficult. But do I think we can make enormous, or do we think we can make, I should say, significant progress? I would say I think we can, if you have the understanding on the expectation side, and you also recognize that this administration may, for a whole host of different reasons, very much working with others, want to lock in progress while others hedge their bets, recognizing that the next administration may ultimately have to be involved heavily in selling something if you can make the kind of breakthrough this year that is necessary. So we're walking, I think, a very thin thread, but I don't put it beyond the realm of possibility, certainly, that we could find our way through to a breakthrough. But I think a lot of it will depend on, if you, for example, now we have something like 40 or 50 outstanding items in the context of the ag text alone. if we can't narrow those things down pretty dramatically, if we can't begin to broach some of the issues on the NAMA side, and then you have the whole question of the degree to which you're going to address services in the near term or part of a agreed subsequent process so people can say, yes, services will be addressed in a meaningful way. And then the whole question of whether or not, there's sufficient political impetus, in the system to accommodate rules, and how important that is to this initial process over the next couple of months. All that is a tinderbox, so it's unknown as to ultimately how it can come out. But I think the economics have been calibrated in. I think most industries, as was noted, have begun to understand exactly what the round could mean, and they've kind of understood it for a while. What you have now, and I think Roberto is right when you point to the dangers. The people that are coming in now from industry tend to be the people who are very nervous about anybody going too far. And that is something that is always the case in trade negotiations. I mean, typically when I was at USTR, I'd hear from certain industries, and I knew where they were coming from miles before they came to me. And I think all of us at USTR went through that experience. But they tend to be the people that are in there all the time. And so you hear from them. And they have a lot of voice on the Hill. And I think that's the case in a lot of different countries around the world. So there's always that danger that we won't be able to kind of get ourselves sufficiently far along to be able to define something as a breakthrough that's actually meaningful. But as I said, I'm kind of the view, and sitting here thinking about this, I expected Jeff to come where he's come from because I've known him for a long time. And I was very curious to hear what the ambassador was going to say, and also my colleague from the Woodrow Wilson Center. But I don't think I think one should come away with from this with a healthy sense of skepticism. But at the same time, I do think there is the possibility here, without question, that the stars are not in such insufficient alignment that something of some sort could be formulated this year that would significantly advance the process in the round. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think it was an excellent summary and an opinion. Before we turn into questions, I just want to add a little bit. What you just saw here is an exercise in trade policy. And I see my colleague, we both teach our students. Trade policy is political, right? And I see a student here too. What we're talking about here is the tree, okay? So it's the influence that public opinion, that the roots of opinion have on the final policy, and that's what we're seeing today with regard to Doha. And that applies to just about everything in trade policy. So that's reality, folks, and hopefully it will work for Doha too. Now, having said that, if the roots opinion is the engine of policy, what do you do when that engine stops, as we're seeing right now, based on what we heard from our colleagues here in the panel? It's very difficult. So unless the government steps in and makes those decisions, then it becomes very difficult on where to go with the policy. So that said, I would like to turn to questions. Please. We have microphones. Yes. Would you please identify yourself?
Sure.
Yeah.
Schott, freelance correspondent. Ambassador Roberta, say that government didn't rule. I think the three presentations are very good. We only need to think a step further. I think we'll find that the key. Your ambassador mentioned about the title of this. Okay. Jeff said that U.S. and EU is the leader. And then there's something, I don't know who have said, the anti-dumping is stay. And Jose cited the World Bank saying this, the problem, trade barrier problem lies in the developing country. Okay, just from all this say, the problem of Doha major is the agricultural product thing. And this EU and US keep fight each other. I think need to do is this. EU and US should get the thing together. And also anti-dumping is a pretty bad thing, should not have.
I'm sorry, sir. Do you have a question?
Okay, my question is this. Important is there's a mention about this political will, and also everybody talk about how difficult it is. And John, you work on the USTR, and USTR is report directed to the President of the United States. And so the political will is depend on him there. Thank you.
No. I guess there's no question. Yes, please, right here.
Yes, Robert Rogowski, International Trade Commission. I actually want to follow up on that because I want to get to the political will question. Other than President Bush's legacy, do you see things at the higher level of government or highest levels that will bring political will to this negotiation in 2008 or 2009? And a second question, if I can keep this, is maybe for John. If the negotiators bring a package deal back, and we don't have TPA authority in hand, what is the process in the U.S. government that the negotiators bring it back to? I mean, would the negotiation then continue on the Hill, or what's that mechanism?
Do you want to take that?
Yes, it's always very difficult for a foreign diplomat to comment on domestic U.S. policy and political will and how it would play out. I've been here precisely. Okay, yeah, that's even more difficult. But let's stick to the U.S. then. Well, I think it is unequivocal, the political engagement of the administration. How that would translate from the push, the political push of the White House, all the way through the decision-making and policy-making process to the negotiating table, that's a different question. I think, as I said during my presentation, that we get very mixed signals if you talk about government in the broader sense. If you talk about government, including Congress, for example, or including other opinion makers. Since I was here in Washington, I turned on the TV. Unfortunately, I turned on the TV for the past 2 days, looking at the news, and a lot of it is about the election process and the candidates, and often, and it's very interesting because. I think more than in previous elections, I heard a lot about trade in this process, which was news to me. Not that that is surprising, but the amount of times, the number of times that this came up was very interesting. And trade actually is almost referred to as the T word. Most of the times, nobody wants to talk about trade. Trade is a bad word; it's a sin or whatever, which is striking. I mean, I served here from 88 to 91. And the U.S. was actually one of the major promoters of liberalization and fought very hard in the Uruguay Round to get opening of markets and lowering of subsidies. And it is a very different scenario that we see today. But having said that, I think it is not unusual to see this kind of dual posturing, particularly in an electoral process, when Congress is engaged in this process as well. So people are looking a lot at the public reaction of what they say. In public, I mean everything, including not only the domestic, not only the private sector that knocks at the door of the USTR, as John was saying, but also the worker, the guy who has the vote in his hand, and what does he think that trade, that T word means for him. If the T word means I'm losing a job, there is a problem. If that is the perception, that is a major problem. But if the perception is, okay, there are new opportunities abroad, therefore industry will grow because of the world market integration and all that, and that's a new job, then that's a different perception. It has a lot to do with how politicians, how the government sells this, how the government views world trade. So I don't think, if you ask me, do we have, other than the administration, an unequivocal voice pushing for trade? I didn't hear it. If there is one, I didn't really hear it. But I also didn't hear unequivocally, even from Congress, people saying we don't want it, okay, which is very important as well. So I didn't hear some people saying we definitely need it, but I didn't hear anybody saying we definitely don't want it. The usual response is very diplomatic. It depends on what we get. So that's, and I guess that's fair, and that's what every other government and delegation would be looking for.
2 quick points for the ambassador. In my view, the trade debate in the presidential campaign has been unusual. Normally, campaigns focus on domestic issues. And what you have seen in both parties is that trade is being discussed. Trade is the platform for discussing the broader concerns about globalization and its impact on U.S. production and employment. And there are significant concerns in many countries. And it's just trade is a lot shorter word than globalization. Second point on Trade Promotion Authority. I think there have been clear signals from the Congress, at least from Chairman Rangel, that he would be willing to entertain an extension of Trade Promotion Authority for the Doha Round if there was a reason to do so. So there has to be a prospect for a good deal in order for the Congress to go and spend the political capital to develop new legislation. That means that you have to have significant progress, as John was saying, in the round by the negotiators, but also recognizes that in the endgame negotiations, when you have the 4 or 5 key concessions that have to be made, that countries will probably expect the U.S. negotiator to have Trade Promotion Authority in her or his pocket. And so I think there is time to do that this year. The time is running rather short, but it could be done. That does not change my forecast, which is very consistent with what John said, that one could make substantial progress this year, but one will have to think about closing the deal next year.
We'll take one more question. Yes.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all the presentation, and it's good to see also former colleagues from Geneva like Roberto. I would like to say that I would like to say my name is Hugo Cairuz from the Embassy of Uruguay in Washington, D.C. I would like to say, first of all, that all negotiating rounds up until now finished. From 1947 up until now, the 8 previous rounds finished. So it seems to me that this, that is the 9th round, will finish. The question is if it will finish this year, next year, or maybe in the future. My question is the following. It was said, I think Roberto mentioned that the economic and financial situation in the world didn't help the multilateral negotiations up until now in the WTO because, as Roberto mentioned, we have good commodity prices, it was a good economic and financial situation, etc. But it seems that this situation could change. So my question is the current economic and financial situation and some indicators that we are seeing now could help, I mean, to advance and to make progress in the multilateral negotiations in Geneva, in particular because these negotiations could make maybe some contribution to the current situation. Thank you.
It's a good question because I actually was a bit careful when I was saying that. I didn't say actually that the current situation didn't help. I said it is one of the causes for the disengagement of the private sector. Now, in my view, it's almost like a dilemma because if conditions are good, the private sector is usually happy. They don't have a whole lot of demands to make. So they're not pushing the government, they're not demandeurs, and therefore they're not there, you know, as the driving force of the negotiations. Of course, we would like to have them pushing and asking and demanding. Now, if you look at the other way around, if you said, well, what if the market conditions were worse? What if we had very low commodity prices with subsidies expenditures at a very high level? Would that help the round? I don't think so. I actually think it would be worse. Because then, for example, in agriculture, the agricultural lobby would be much more engaged, but in the negative sense, that they wouldn't want to make any concessions. So when I said that the current situation disengaged the private sector, it is a side effect. You never have the economic conditions always working for you or working for you in all senses. So good conditions usually means the private sector will disengage a little bit, and that's why governments have to push. That's why governments have to take on and have to look far ahead. Okay, the fact that subsidies are not a major problem for my soybean producer now doesn't mean that it won't be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. But the government has to have that foresight and therefore plan for that. The private sector is usually looking at the more immediate gain, the more immediate interest. So the governments, I think, have to take a more prospective view. Now, I don't think, again, that if we had very poor market conditions in the world, that would help the round. That could make it a lot more difficult, actually.
Yeah, I would just only add that at present, the agriculture situation kind of cuts in a number of different ways because on the one hand you have the energy side of the equation which is driving up cost structures for agriculture. On the other hand, you have record high commodity prices. So you do have, you have a good and a bad side to this. On the other hand, I think most in agriculture in the U.S. context in any case, and I would venture to say in the EU and a lot of other places around the world that have really been focusing on the agriculture part of this, that people have started they've calibrated in, to use that term I used earlier, what the implications of the round could be by and large. But they're looking at what could be some very important endgame decisions. But with prices being where they are, that would certainly argue for getting people in the U.S. context to think about if we end up with something, as I think Brazil would hope, and a lot of others would hope, although some would not hope, that's the nature of the round, that the domestic support side of the equation, the market access side of the equation, would be pretty extensive. And so it would mean real things in the sense of, at a minimum, now when you have lower support in the U.S. in light of high prices, you lock in something, and what they're thinking about is the future. And the Farm Bill debate right now in the U.S. is not really, it's less implicated by all this than some would like it to be in the international community. But that's in part because we're thinking, some of these guys are thinking farther out, and the question is how much of an implication will what we do in the round tie into domestic reform here, out into the future. The U.S. undoubtedly will have to address the question at some point if we get an ag package that I think most people can accept, is going to have to lock itself into certain types of reform. And that's going to run into politics, not necessarily right now in a huge way, but it definitely will down the road potentially. And so that's in real terms. So that's how I'm kind of thinking about it. On the manufacturing side, I mean, I think a lot in the manufacturing community, the nature of the manufacturing sector in the United States has been continuously evolving, as it has in agriculture too. But, it's a global business now. As large as the U.S. manufacturing sector is, 2.5 times the size of the Chinese sector, which some people tend to forget, it is a changing manufacturing sector that's much more involved in global integration. So I think a lot of them have factored this in on the manufacturing side and are hoping to be quite ambitious. If you talk to the NAM and others, the people who represent that segment of the community, they want to move the ball pretty significantly on the NAMA side.
Thank you, John. José Raúl, you have the last word.
Well, I actually just wanted to comment on your question, and I concur definitely with my panelists. I think that thinking about the economic crisis and whether the crisis actually entrenches and becomes deeper, and one of the things that one has to think, or one would wish to think about in terms of the political will aspect of what is needed to conclude the round is, to what extent in the repertoire of policy options that politicians have, certainly in the case of the United States, to what extent does the conclusion of the Doha Round of trade negotiations seem to be understood as an element or as a tool for addressing a very prescient problem of the global economy? And the reason I raise this is because precisely, on the other hand, we've been talking about how trade has become the culprit, that the word trade has been used to talk about globalization, et cetera, and to think that somehow there lies a fault in what is happening to the United States, whereas it might be the other way around, that actually trade has sustained a tremendous amount of abundance and economic growth in this country. And in an election year, and going back to the point of whether it's doable or not, yes, it is doable, but in an election year in the United States, the array of political elements required to answer that question affirmatively are somewhat scarce. And therefore, not entirely out of the question, but certainly not there to make a positive conclusion for this year, I would say.
Okay, you don't have the last word.
I don't have the last word.
Yeah, just one. No, I heard all this talk about the globalization, and it's interesting that people seem to have globalization as an abstract notion, and they don't really actually realize the kind of impact it has in today's world. And let me give you one example. We were having a bilateral with a particular delegation, and I won't say which, but you may guess. In this delegation was expressing concerns about the outcome of the round in terms of our tariffs, Brazil's tariffs or Mercosur tariffs, of one particular product. And I said, and I understood the question, and I said, but look, I was looking at the numbers. You guys don't export this to Brazil. So what's the point? I mean, why are you so concerned? And the guy said, well, but China does. And I said, so what? What's the problem? They're my companies. So you have people actually, this is the kind of interaction that you have today. And so nothing is obvious anymore. And often the political will that I said, that there has to be somebody up there looking at the global picture is even more important than it ever was. So I thought since globalization was mentioned so many times, that this is the kind of thing that we should bear in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. This concludes our first panel. I would like to invite you all to join me in applauding the speakers. And I'd like to invite panel 2 to come over and so we can start.
John? John. Let's try. Say hello to Tom Felsberg.
Hi, Tom. How are you? No. Thomas Felsberg.
Let me give him a card. Our firms have been in contact.
Yeah. I will stay and listen to you.
I don't think so, and that one either, right?
I will listen to the others. My role is...
You're the moderator.
I'm just the moderator.
Are you missing your cup? Sage também.
So I think I'm supposed to keep time. That's a budget. So you'll be the last one.
I'll be
Hi, how are you?
Sure.
Yeah. Your reputation very well. Hi.
Hi. Colvin, Wisconsin.
Pleasure. How are you? Great. Oh, thanks.
Several
Yes, you know,
guys.
absolutely. My cards.
It took a 6:30 plane from New York. It took me 3 days to recover.
Hey, Cohen, where am I? At the end?
It's like, I was looking at all of them, they're not on the back side.
The German?
All right. Let's get it going. Let's get it going. Gary, which one is my name on it?
Oh, substantially, but I mean, he yells at me from there. He just yells at me. Hey, John. How are you doing? Did you leave something here? Oh.
Hi. Gary, we're sitting beside each other back there. Good to see you. That's good. That's good. So,
Give it up the time constraint. You might as well find how much I'll fit in.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Next time.
Good.
that's not me.
Nice to see you. Huh? I'm going to stay and listen to you. Good. Thanks.
Hi, Andy.
So much when you feel. Sure. Thanks for the invitation.
I did bring pictures. I stopped
Good.
by my purse. And I'm glad I'm not the only one who brought my copy of the agreements.
If I could ask everyone to please sit down so we can start the next panel, we would really appreciate it. Otherwise, we're going to be very late.
Hello. Hi. I'm Tom Felsberg.
Thank you. I'll give the word to our moderator for the second panel, Mr. Thomas Felsberg.
Good morning. Global warming and environmental preservation. What options international trade law has to offer? That's the topic of our panel. Again, I will follow the example of our leader here, Luisio. I will not read the biographies of all those present in the panel to save some time, but in the materials you can read all the details. But here on my extreme right, again without any political preferences, I have Andrew Scheuer from Sidley and Austin. To my immediate right, but more moderately, Gwen Kripke, Senior Policy Advisor, Oxfam America. And as a moderate left-winger, Lynn Fisher-Fox, Counsel for Thompson and Hine. Then we have Gary Horlick from WilmerHale. And to the extreme left, we have Nicole Bivens-Collinson, which will act as our commentator. Again, we'll try to keep our presentations to 10 minutes. With 2 minutes grace. I'll start waving papers here if somebody doesn't finish, so you'll know what it means, right, if I start going wild here. So why don't we start with Andrew Scheuer from Sidley and Austin. Please, Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I thought I might do is, because I don't know where everyone is on their knowledge base on the WTO law and how it would apply to measures affecting climate change, to give you a brief overview, really brief, and then to talk about 3 ideas that have surfaced through which a government that was imposing some kind of restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions would seek to induce other governments to do so. One idea is a so-called carbon tax to impose a fee at the border on imports of certain goods. Another is a carbon intensity standard to impose on all goods, but particularly on the imports of certain products, a requirement that those goods are produced with emissions of no more than a certain amount of greenhouse gases. And third, a requirement that that importers produce for the government that's importing allowances that represent a permit to emit a certain number of greenhouse gas quantum, carbon equivalents. So the idea here is that if you had in the United States, for example, a cap-and-trade program, so that the government would impose on domestic producers certain requirements to cap emissions, what could you do with respect to foreign governments? And let's assume for purposes of analysis that you're not working within a global environmental agreement. That is, you haven't achieved at the outset an agreement through which governments would all agree to take action on their own. And the point I'd like to leave you with as I go through what the WTO teaches us is that the best thing to do, I think, is to think inside the box, to think small. Because of the 3 examples that I mentioned, 2 of them, in order to be effective, would really require stretching beyond WTO jurisprudence as we know it. I'll read you what we have in the WTO law, but most of what we know about how the WTO would apply comes from case law. And the case law really doesn't allow us to go to the carbon tax or the carbon intensity standard. It just hasn't gotten there yet. But if you had a domestic cap-and-trade program, you could design a system through which you can impose very similar regulatory requirements on imports and stay within the confines of WTO jurisprudence. That is, to be very conservative in what the WTO teaches us. Let me try to explain what those elements are. And I'll read you the key here, because I think the key is in Article 20, paragraph G of the GATT. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the GATT has a series of general exceptions to trade laws, and one of those exceptions, G, allows a government to maintain a measure even if it violates the other positive rules of the GATT, if it is relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, and if that measure is taken or made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So the pieces there are as follows. The measure has to be relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. And what we know from case law is that the relatedness means has been interpreted as primarily aimed at. So if something is primarily aimed at environmental protection, conservation, it's also been interpreted as having a close and genuine relationship between the ends and means. So a very close ends-means relationship between the measure that you take and the objective, the conservation or environmental objective. We also know from the old tuna case, a case that came out under the GATT 1947, in that situation, the problem was that the United States had imposed restrictions on tuna because of the incidental kills of dolphin, and the restriction was drawn on the basis of kill rates in the United States. That is, we were judging foreign fisheries on the basis of whether they exceeded the kill rates in the U.S. fleet. The problem was that it was a real-time assessment. So we told people that they couldn't exceed our own kill rates, but we didn't know what those were until after the fact. So it was impossible for foreign fleets to meet the standards since they didn't know it at the time. And the panel said there that a limitation on trade based on such unpredictable conditions could not be regarded as being primarily aimed at the conservation of dolphins. So that's one other thing we know from the jurisprudence, that in order to be relating to be primarily aimed at, you have to be predictable, that the conditions that you provide for importers have to be clear and predictable. The next thing is exhaustible natural resources. We haven't had a case that says that the environment, the entire planet, is an exhaustible natural resource, but certainly given the case law, which has found that that the global commons, including and dolphin and sea turtles and clean air, are all understood as exhaustible natural resources, I think it'd be a fairly conservative view that clean water, air, land, arable land, or livable land all could be deemed as exhaustible natural resources. But that has not been subject to any cases in the WTO. Finally, made effective in conjunction with domestic restrictions, that's been interpreted as even-handedness. And that was so in the U.S. gasoline case, where the U.S. Regulations on gasoline were challenged because of differential application to Brazil and Venezuela, among others. So you have to, in order to impose a measure in a way that is deemed to be in conjunction with, there has to be even-handedness. Finally, the real test will come in the so-called chapeau, the general provisions that apply to all of the specific exceptions in the GATT. And the main one, the main two are that you have to impose these measures so that they wouldn't constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade. And all those phrases have been interpreted in recent cases, indeed as recently as in the case that was brought against Brazil on its restrictions on tires. Basically, under that scenario, what you need to worry about is it's very clear that you have to take the conditions of individual countries into account. And because of the phrasing, between countries where the same conditions prevail. And you focus on the fact that where you're treating different countries differently, there has to be a good rationale for it, which is exactly what the appellate body said in the Brazilian case. Okay, very quickly, let me try to apply this law. Let's talk about the carbon tax. The problem with the carbon tax is that as yet, we have had no situation in the WTO or GATT law where you have a regulatory system in the United States and you offset that by imposing a tax. Certainly, theoretically, you should be able to convert the regulatory cost. Well, I shouldn't say, it wouldn't be very simple, but if you could try to take the regulatory cost of a cap and trade program in the United States figure out what, monetize it, then you could try to impose that tax on imports so as to induce them to do the right thing, if they haven't done it already, and also to achieve some balance on competitiveness, to try to offset the regulatory cost onto the imports. The problem is that we have never had in GATT or WTO jurisprudence a situation where it's been permissible to impose a tax at the border to offset something that's not a tax domestically. You'll hear the phrase border tax adjustment or border adjustment, and it's very unfortunate. I think I've seen some of the papers that have been coming out even the last few weeks. They seem very confusing. It's a very specific term of art, and it really refers to idea of imposing at the border a tax so that imports are subject to the same tax that you have domestically. Without a tax, a carbon tax domestically, there doesn't seem to be any way to justify a tax at the border, a pure tax on imports. Secondly, let me just think about the standard for a carbon intensity. The carbon intensity standard has the problem that it has been justified largely under the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, the TBT agreement. And so far we've had almost no jurisprudence under the TBT agreement, and in particular, it would be the first time that you would have a pure process or production methodology standard, a PPM, trying to be justified under the TBT agreement. There's legislative or negotiating history that makes it pretty clear that it was not intended, the TBT agreement was not intended by the drafters to cover a pure PPM. That is a regulation that focuses not on the product itself, but how it was made. If there is no relationship between the product and the characteristic that you're regulating on. That's why this allowance requirement, which is reflected now in Title VI of one of the bills, 2191, so you can look at it actually as I'm describing it, why it's the most conservative approach, because it embraces the WTO jurisprudence. Under this scenario, you would impose an allowance requirement on imports on carbon-intensive goods, that is the most near to the goods that are subject to the domestic program, if the countries from which the goods are coming have not taken comparable action with respect to climate change. And the requirement, the allowance, would be adjusted to take into account the level of economic development or the conditions within that country, as well as the extent to which that allowances are given away for free to U.S. producers. Because, without going into detail on cap and trade, U.S. producers will have an advantage otherwise, because some allowances will simply be given away by Congress, while others would be available only through an auction. So under this scenario, and again, it's the one that's now reflected in a proposal that came from the American Electric Power in conjunction with International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. The proposal embraces the most conservative approach to WTO jurisprudence. It certainly is not a protectionist approach. It's an environmental approach that would allow you to impose the allowance requirement on imports if that were deemed to be appropriate. So let me stop there, and again, as you hear other ideas, we can come back and talk about how the WTO jurisprudence would apply to it.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this excellent presentation. Gwen Kripke, please.
Thanks very much. Following Andy, I'd like to talk maybe a little more conceptually rather than sort of textually about the issue of trade law and environmental outcomes. First, I'd like to say that I probably should have been on the panel before, because Oxfam has a very established set of opinions and positions around the Doha Round, and that would have been easy. This area, I think, is much less clear to many of the stakeholders or players in the field. And I see that sort of rationalizing and synthesizing these two fields of policy and law, trade, and environmental concerns is kind of a dream for policy wonks right now. I count myself a policy wonk, so this is pretty much fun. It's also a potential bounty for trade lawyers and attorneys who see lots of hooks and opportunities in this integration process between the two fields. I was going to give you some commentary about the challenges and the concerns that underlie these issues. I'll try to be brief in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that there are still a lot of poor people and that they face a lot of challenges and that hundreds of millions of people are still hungry. And so for an organization like Oxfam, trade has been a priority for several years now to try to unlock some economic growth for developing countries. But climate change is a looming challenge, a very big one for humanitarian and development concerns. And the forecasts range from bad to hysterically bad for poor people in developing countries. And climate change will hit rich and poor alike, but rich people are more, and rich countries are much more capable of responding and adapting to climate change with existing resources. So for an organization like Oxfam, climate change is a growing concern, a major concern, and at this point in history, a big opportunity, I think. So this leads me to one point, which is that there's a lot of urgency about resolving these issues and taking action on these issues. And the scientists tell us that we must act very soon in order to be able to forestall the worst impacts of climate change. We know we will have climate change in front of us, but the question is how much climate change. And every year we wait means that we will have more climate change, and the impacts will mostly be felt by vulnerable people. So we have a window of maybe 5, 10, maybe 15 years to take very forceful action around climate change. It's worth noting also that in order to help solve the problem of climate change, you have to be contributing to the problem. And in this way, it's largely developed countries that are creating the problem and therefore most responsible for solving the problem. It's not, but the growth projections, of course, for developing countries, especially the larger developing countries, is very big. And so one of the deep political issues is how much should they contribute, how much can they contribute, what's fair. Now, we have an alignment of stars, you might say, to take action with the UN negotiations and with growing interest in the US Congress to take action. So then this question, how can trade law contribute to a positive environmental outcome? And maybe more specifically, or more to the point, how can trade law inhibit a positive environmental outcome? First, a few thoughts about how trade liberalization contributes or inhibits positive environmental outcomes. Somebody else who was very smart thought about sort of four areas or ways in which trade liberalization contributes. First, to the extent that trade liberalization creates growth and increased prosperity, this will have a mixed effect, hard to estimate on let's say climate change, environmental outcomes. On the one hand, you have more consumption and so forth, but then again, you might have better consumption of more efficient products. So you might buy more SUVs, but you might also buy more solar panels. So it's a mixed bag about the prosperity that the trade liberalization might produce. Not an easy one to estimate in terms of what the impacts will be. Second is in the composition of trade. To the extent that trade liberalization permits greater use of comparative advantage, you'll again see mixed results. Think of ethanol. Ethanol produced from cane in Brazil is a better climate production, or produces less carbon dioxide than ethanol produced in the United States from corn. So if the United States liberalized its ethanol market, then you might see a positive environmental outcome. Or think of steel. U.S. steel may be produced using natural gas, but if we liberalized our market and had more Chinese steel produced using coal, that would be a negative one. So the composition is, again, a mixed result. You can make econometric forecasts of what it would be. Third is an area of technology. To the extent that liberalization helps diffuse technologies, it will tend to have a positive environmental impact. Because most new technologies are more efficient than old technologies, this is a pretty clear plus. And lastly, to the extent that liberalization increases trade and transport, that's probably a pretty clear negative because that's just consuming more energy. So how might trade law contribute? Well, you see a sort of mixed bag in terms of trade liberalization, and to the extent that trade law is about imposing or upholding liberalization commitments, it's a little bit hard to forecast. I think one key element about trade law and how it will be impinge on or intervene with creation of climate change regimes is that it helps to give leverage to non-OECD countries. They can bring cases and they can become part of the discussion of what regimes are put into place outside of the UN process. And I think in creating a climate change regime, this is a very important element. The equity elements of climate change are probably underrepresented in the discussion and need more representation in the debate. And trade law provides an opportunity for some equity elements to be brought in, that all the imposition or a disproportionate burden not be placed on the growth of developing countries. This issue of technology diffusion is another area where trade law has a potentially very big impact. The technology we absolutely want, because we see a positive impact, the diffusion of technologies, but trade law has potentially a big impact in a variety of ways. First of all, to the extent that technology is transferred, that's, we think, a good thing. But to the extent that IP relates to that, you can see big problems. And I don't think we know enough to know exactly what the impacts would be. But this is an area of increasing concern among environmentalists and development specialists to figure out how can we make sure that innovation does go forward, that technologies are diffused, but that all the incentives are set right. And so I highlight this as a key area of concern. It's not just about intellectual property, of course, but how do we assure the diffusion of these technologies with intellectual property and trade law being a key component? To deal with climate change, it's absolutely necessary to address the issue of competitiveness. You hear this constantly in the political debate around dealing with climate change. And just within the last few days, there's been papers written and submitted in Congress about competitiveness issues around climate change. If the U.S. And the presumption is that any type of climate change regime will tend to make the firms under that regime less competitive with firms outside that regime. So if the U.S. takes action on climate change, it will make U.S. producers less competitive to other producers. And so this is a big political economy question. It's clearly going to have to be dealt with any regime that comes in politically. And so measures like the ones that Andrew was talking about become a key element to passing legislation or any kind of regime. And this is a key area where trade law will play. Now, in preparation for this meeting, I've been reading a bunch of papers this week, partly to bone up. And the good news is I think there's a surprising amount of consensus emerging that about what shape these kinds of measures might look like, and the idea that they probably are compliant with WTO law. And if they're not, then there's probably enough goodwill to and exceptions and waivers possible to make them work. And so this leads me to my final conclusion, which is back to the urgency issue, which is that I think it's potentially easy to spend our times in the abstractions and seeing all the problems. But I think overall, there's more potential for trade law to play a contributing, mediating role, but not an obstructive role to a good environmental outcome around climate change. So, and in addition, provide leverage in particular for developing countries to have more of a say about what regime is imposed in rich countries and then internationally. This is my presentation.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I guess this round of applause is for our first two presenters, right? We'll have another one for I hope so. Depends. Well, I guess, Lynn, it's your turn now.
Thank you. Matt Nicely was supposed to be here today, and he asked me to fill in for him this week. And so I was thinking about this. And when I was in law school, my friends said they were thinking that I was the person most likely to be found 10 years after graduation wandering the streets of D.C. with a shopping cart, wearing 4 coats and muttering under my breath, carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax. Well, that hasn't happened yet, but I've got a year to go. And I've spent the last 9 years muttering a lot more about zeroing and national treatment than I have about carbon emissions. So I'm jumping back in on the climate change issue. The way I look at this, I looked at the title of this panel and said, options, what are the options that trade law gives us? And I thought there were 2 ways to look at that. One was, what are the limited options available to us given the trade regime? What can we do under the tight rules of the trade regime? Or the other way to look at it, which is the way I looked at it first, was what does the trade regime open up for us in building a climate regime or an emissions reduction regime or a carbon regime that functions efficiently, both economically and environmentally? And it seems like we're talking about the former at first when Andy spoke, and I think Andy's kind of forced into that box by the lack of a global regime puts us in a box where we're talking about individual countries taking unilateral steps to try to reduce their emissions and then dealing with this pressing problem that's both political and environmental of competitiveness, and how do you politically convince your industry that greenhouse gas emission reductions is important when they see it as a competitiveness problem. But there's also the problem of leakage. If you're enacting a domestic regime, you don't want all your benefits just kind of leaking out to the countries that aren't taking steps. So it is important to address these things on a unilateral basis, but I'm a little concerned that by trying to conservatively force this into a WTO law, existing WTO law, we might be not finding the optimal solution either from a trade perspective or from an environmental perspective. And it's kind of easy for me to stand over here, having not thought about this for years, and say, let's do something different, or let's step outside the box. And so I don't want to be the bomb thrower. I think these are carefully crafted proposals that are being considered on the Hill, and the EU is considering something similar. They may well be the best regime, but I think that it's important also to take a step back and see what does the WTO offer us in terms of a way to address the climate regime in a broader context. I think everyone in this, when you're looking at domestic regimes and border measures or unilateral steps, the temptation to interject protectionism into those kinds of measures is almost irresistible. People of goodwill, WTO scholars can craft carefully crafted language, but once it gets into the political realm, it's almost inevitable that a little bit of protectionism here, a little bit of protectionism there will be inserted, and the result will be, or could be, that's not necessarily will be, the result could be a regime that ends up really creating a lot of frictions for trade, particularly if there are different regimes in different countries, and it also may not result in the best possible or even close to optimal carbon emissions reductions that we're looking for. So what does that leave us in terms of what is the WTO, what does the trade law offer us in terms of options for climate change? I think Gawain's presentation was laid out very importantly some of the benefits that we see from trade, and it's important to have a climate regime that kind of works in conjunction with the trade regime such that you have the climate externalities are taken into account in things like the transportation effects and the technology effects and the other effects that you get from trade. And if we don't have something in place and it is urgent, then we're going to lose those benefits, and we're going to have more entrenched interests to find that we have to face as we try to move forward. I think it was Pascal Lamy was talking at the Bali Convention, and he basically, it seemed to me, said that the WTO toolbox was there, and it was a very useful toolbox for addressing climate change, but that the trade rules should follow the international environmental rules, that the international environmental rules should guide the way the trade rules were implemented. And I think by saying that, we're looking at, there is flexibility in the WTO to take on perhaps a different approach to carbon emissions, or to take on different unilateral or multilateral approaches to addressing the problem of countries that are not part of a emissions reduction scheme. And for example, if we look at the TBT agreements or the SPS agreements, these are agreements that take us, that carve out special rules, if you want to look at it that way, and look towards international standards and encouraging international standards. And that kind of approach can reduce a lot of those frictions, because you don't have the differentiation amongst the various countries in the way they approach things if you have an international standard. So after the panel this morning, it sort of would be kind of disingenuous to sit up here and say what we need are more negotiations, because the likelihood of success there is probably pretty slim at the moment. But I do think it's important, when we're talking about the options that the trade regime offers us, to look at ways that countries that are interested in moving forward with a greenhouse gas regime can work together, can create rules that function within the trade, within the important rules that the WTO imposes, the important trade rules that protect countries from discrimination, but also perhaps open up options for a broader and more effective greenhouse gas emissions reduction program that's not necessarily, that might be not necessarily immediately evident from the conservative way that we're interpreting WTO law today.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Gary Horlick, please.
I want to follow up Gawain's dichotomy. I think this will be a nightmare more than a dream, and particularly for developing countries, or most developing countries, I should say. My first point, which if you haven't figured this out already, existing international trade law is mostly inconsistent with most proposed climate change solutions. I'll give you a trivial example. There's different subsidy rules in the WTO for ethanol and biodiesel. Why? Because in 1993, no one was thinking about this. Ethanol is listed as agricultural, biodiesel is industrial. They have different subsidy regimes. If anyone here sitting in Washington thinks a lobbyist for either of those industries is going to let the difference interfere with his or her preferred outcome, you can forget it. I mean, it's just not going to happen. This week's Automotive Weekly has reports that someone from NRDC proposing a $40 billion subsidy program for Detroit to retool. If China or Japan proposed doing this, you can imagine the U.S. reaction, right, in the WTO. Portfolios, mandates for renewable energy portfolios or biofuels. We already have a mandate for ethanol, right? The result has been to drive up prices for poor people in developing countries to a point where they can't afford to eat. It's not a good idea, in other words. And it's also, by the way, possibly inconsistent with the WTO. So there are lots of other examples that you can go through. If you go through the existing WTO agreements and compare them with a lot of the proposals, you realize that they're inconsistent. One of the reasons they're inconsistent, as Andy, I think, implied, a lot of the people making the proposals, in good faith, I'm not denying them, aren't aware of the WTO rules, quite understandably. These are two areas coming together now at lightning speed. The problem, I think, is when the collision occurs, problem from my point of view, when the collision occurs, international trade law is going to get run over by climate change. The political support for international trade rules, which the earlier panel accurately described as weak, is infinitely smaller than the political support which is growing for doing something about climate change. So saying that the WTO doesn't allow it is not going to be a very strong read. So what I want to focus on is what to do about it, and this is where I get even gloomier. If you think about it just analytically, one possibility is to go to the WTO and negotiate a set of rules for climate change, for how international trade can interact with solutions to climate change. You could do this through a waiver. You could do it through a standalone agreement. The reason for doing this, by the way, and the advantage is, instead of changing all the WTO rules completely, you simply change them just for the climate change proposals and leave them in place where they've already been tested for international trade. This first option is probably the best option and the least likely to occur, but it is doable. The example is that as part of the Doha negotiations, one of the more successful negotiations, though admittedly not complete and hostage to developments elsewhere, is negotiations of an agreement on fisheries subsidies. As negotiations go, this has gone very smoothly, and the best bet, and a very strong bet, is if there's a Doha negotiation completed, there'll be a very good agreement on fisheries subsidies. The point here is the agreement on subsidies on fisheries is not, first WTO agreement like this, not aimed at the trade effects of fisheries subsidies. It's aimed exclusively